What's up, everybody, and welcome to the August 2nd, 2024 episode of Why Am I Like This? I have no idea when this episode's actually going to make it to the podcast, but I trust that the timing will be perfect. This is an episode of a series within the Broom Radio podcast called Why Am I Like This? And Why Am I Like This is a container that I've formed in order to pose responses to questions that have been posed to me, which do not feel like they are posed in a container which has the adequate containment for the kind of response that feels like it would best serve the offering of the question and also best serve what I'll basically call the cosmos. And I feel like there are ways that I could answer the questions that are posed to me without trying to serve the cosmos at the same time. And sometimes I do. But then it feels much more dramatic and entertaining to behave as if I have to take these questions into a specific container in order to serve the cosmos. And I feel like that part's true, but then that doesn't necessarily mean I can't answer the questions in ways which don't serve the cosmos fully. But like I said, it's just much more entertaining that way. And, I've done more than my fair share of answering questions in ways which aren't aligned with the cosmos and also aren't aligned with the cosmos inside my body. So I would say that it serves the cosmos outside my body for me to serve the cosmos inside my body. And in order to serve the cosmos inside my body, it feels aligned to indulge in a little bit of drama for the entertainment of my cosmos and maybe for the entertainment of some of the other beings in the cosmos outside of me. And that's why I have a container called Why Am I Like This? And I really appreciate those of you who listen live and make offerings live and who listen asynchronously, or I'll call it in a retarded way. And also make offerings of awareness in your retarded way, by which I mean delayed. Um, and I would say just listening is an offering, but besides being retarded in the sense that it's delayed, not in any pejorative sense, um, it's also not exactly the same as offering it live. And it's also not exactly the same as offering voice. And it's also not exactly the same as offering text while I'm conducting this container. And I mean that in the sense of like somebody wearing a tuxedo and holding a little stick. Um, but if you would like to attend live and make offerings of non-retarded awareness and or text and or voice, then I feel like it will probably only happen if it's aligned, which is to say that I would love for you to do so. And you can do that by joining the Broom Discord, which is a spiritual container whereby a co-governed community collaboratively collaboratively defines the rules of what I'll call a game by which we play the game of the broom. And I would say that in the game of the broom is a lineage of spiritual refinement, which often involves a lot of animated gifs and sort of like comedic and tragic, cool, comedical custom emojis, and many discussions about pop culture and politics and economics, but also many discussions about resolving ancestral trauma and many lineages of alchemical and spiritual practice. And it's a game that contains lineage spaces for lineages called the clock, which is a lineage for remembering different praxis of astrology and astronomy towards understanding how our observable universe functions within the observable universe, and much more so the aspects of the observable universe which are not yet made observable, and also hold space for a lineage called Sharia Way or Shawama Way or Sierra Nevada Way, but I would call it Sharia Way, which is a lineage which is, I would say, reforming principally, I would say, Abrahamic faith traditions, but I would say it includes the faith traditions and the alchemical traditions of other children of Adam and Eve that may have, some of them may have been children of Abraham, but may not be included within the family of Abraham. And then some of them were probably descendants of Adam and Eve, who I dare say existed before Abraham, or Ibrahim was like a twinkle in the eye of his father. And I would say that we're holding space for those lineages to create a space where they can coexist and co-cultivate one another generatively. And that's Sharia Way. There's also a lineage space in the broom called 000, which is a lineage space that I created, but is not only mine. And that's a lineage space where I create and hold space for transmissions of, I would say, like many wisdom codes related to like becoming an exorcist, and therefore I'll say embodying the ability to create space in a metaphysical sense. And to explain that, I'll say that for me, many people would say that like if you come across like some land and then you build a house on it, you're creating a space. And I would say that that's untrue from my perspective. I would say that you're filling a space. For me to create a space is like a metaphysical act, which I would say has involved in the past the process of exorcism, opening holes in space and time to allow transmission through time space between space times. For instance, opening a portal between the space time of Sirius C and the space time of Earth, so that wisdom codes can be transmitted between the space time of Sirius C and the space time of Earth, so that the space time of Sirius C and the space time of Earth may become more unified as a space time, which is to say that the awareness of the body of Sirius C and Earth will become more unified as one self. And I would say in the history of metaphysical praxis, this was often like a traumatizing event, right? To like open a hole in the space-time of one fabric of space-time or one gravitational body, or you could say like one collective consciousness, like to open a hole in Earth to allow for wisdom codes from another planet or star which had transmitted, or I'll say like in order to transmit between those bodies. I feel like probably most of y'all who are listening could understand how this might be traumatic. But I would say that this is probably, and I would say like definitely from my perspective, the way life came to Earth and the way that life has been influenced on Earth from other so-called extraterrestrial consciousnesses, but I would say other star and planetary consciousness within the realm of all that is. And I would say that this also happened to those stars and planets. And, I was about to say before it happened to Earth, but before is sort of like a construct which assumes a linear time. And since we're talking about different spaces and times, I hope it makes sense that there is no real, like, objective, so to speak, before and after. But I'll say that in current time, there are enough ruptures in the space time fabric of Earth and the space time fabric of other planetary and I'll say solar consciousnesses, which have also been, I'll say, covered up by the scar tissue of disorganized space and time, aka awareness, such that it's sufficient to dismember the disorganized space time in order to remember space time, which is to say that it's possible, you could say, to like repair portals of space time between different planetary and solar consciousnesses to forge a more continuous connection, which allows for less distorted transmission between planetary and solar consciousnesses in the body of, I'll say, Shekinah. And I would say that, like, in current time, the way that this maps to the process of trauma integration or psychic healing is not necessarily well understood in any one being, and it's very poorly understood on an interpersonal basis, which is, I would say, why we have massive industries dedicated to the field of, quote, medicine, unquote, and the field of, quote, psychology, unquote, and the field of, quote, psychiatry, unquote, and the field of, quote, pharmaceuticals, unquote. And that would also include, less proximally, the field of, quote, war, unquote. But I would say that as we begin to assemble more complete and accurate personal understandings of the nature of psychic healing, then we'll begin to assemble better interpersonal understandings of the field of psychic healing. And that our improving understanding of the field of psychic healing will obviate a lot of what's happening in those industries. And we will also understand, I would say, what it means to be an exorcist. And I'll say, coinciding with this improvement of understanding of psychic healing will be a better understanding of the actions of a being named Set and the exorcisms that he performed on a being named Osiris. I would say a better understanding of the actions of many occultists and so-called dark magicians and the necessity of what they were doing. And I would also say co-arising with a better understanding of psychic healing will be an understanding of the crimes of many religious factions and institutions in castigating and punishing and driving these praxis underground. And I would also say we'll come to a better understanding of what I call psychic abuse or spiritual abuse, including in normative circumstances such as religious schools or Catholic missions, um, or I would say even like astrological readings that people receive from internet celebrities. And I would even say like tweets where people that you don't know tell you that they love you, but that's just my opinion. Um, the broom also holds space for lineages that I don't know of in current time, which is interesting as I peer into like why I started that sentence. But there is another lineage in the broom called Yaga, which is the lineage space of one of my favorite collaborators, Intrepid Bodies. There's a lineage space called the Stick, which relates to a huge body of work that we've only just embarked upon relating to what I sometimes call trust and safety or the field of psychic abuse. And then we also have lineages in the broom relating to the governing of the broom called grounding, gardening, and tending. And like I said, many lineages that are still to come. So again, if you would like to join the broom, you can go to thebroomradio.us for a link to join, and you'll be able to tune into the kind of claptrap which I traffic in Why Am I Like This, but also you'll be able to tune into many live containers that are often recorded, but not always recorded. And I would say sometimes make it to the public podcasts. But you can also make sure that you're updated on all of the recordings by becoming a member at buymeacoffee.com/thebroomradio/membership. Or if you'd like to support the broom, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/thebroomradio. And finally, I'll say before I actually open this container, I'll say truth. You can support my work at buymeacoffee.com/Nobuhajime-chan. You can sign up for 000 at buymeacoffee.com/Nobuhajime-chan at /membership. And you can find out more about all of my offerings at nobuhajimechan.com. And with that, I'm going to formally open this container by repeating the guarantee that I make at the beginning of all episodes of Why Am I Like This, which is I guarantee that contexts will not be enmeshed or karma will not be accumulated. I guarantee that contexts will be disenmeshed, aka that karma will be resolved or harmonized. And I also guarantee that I will hold space for feedback regarding this container, including for disputes arising with respect to my guarantee. And I'll say that for this episode of Why Am I Like This, I felt called to bring in, I'll say an offering, because it doesn't quite feel like a question, or only a question, but the question comes from Intrepid Bodies. And it goes, in the past, we've talked about metaphysical and astral robbery as it pertains to a thread which currently says unknown because of bugs in Discord. And the praxis of Mariam Hasna, when it comes to astral and metaphysical robbery, how would you explain that dynamic and your experience with it relating to New Earth Mystery School? And I'll say that, like, the container which I'm forming now in response to this offering, which also includes this offering, um, I'm going to say feels like it wants to be called psychic abuse to me. Does that align for you, Hoda? Yes, it does, says Hoda. Um, so I guess what I'm tuning into with regard to this container right now is, first of all, I want to talk a little bit about my spiritual path and how I found out about Mariam Hasna. And then I also want to say out loud that I want to hold plenty of space for Hoda to talk about her experiences in a similar vein, if she wants to. And I'm also going to hold space for weaving this into a larger transmission relating to psychic abuse. And I also want to say that I'm seeding the container with plenty of grace because I think that a lot of the things I'm talking about and I want to feel comfortable and safe in calling psychic abuse are probably normative. But I would also say that the dynamic of psychic abuse is that it creates normativity. And I would also say that it tends to hide itself in a way which allows it to reify itself through more and more acts of psychic abuse. And the reason I'm saying this is because I feel like it's very important to say that I don't believe that Mariam Hasna feels like she's an abusive person, but I do feel like she's an abusive person. And I feel like this happens mostly unconsciously through behavior that arises from her vessel when she's dissociated and or triggered. And I feel like in my metaphysical framework, dissociation happens when someone's triggered, but I know that colloquially people tend to feel like being triggered only relates to like being angry or maybe like crying or some kind of response, which I would say is like normatively considered to be negative. Whereas I feel like often a response to being triggered is to dissociate or to become kind of like calm ish in a way which to me feels disembodied from the knowing of my body. And I feel like often people can appear to be like very spiritually attuned within these states of dissociation. But to me, it's usually a sign that somebody's been triggered out of, I would say, like the fullness of presence into programs, behavioral programs that I would say cause people to appear calm and serene and even wise, um, but nonetheless disembodied to people like me who I feel like have a particular embodiment. And I feel like it's worth saying that this is all just from my perspective. And many people might feel that I'm disembodied and that because I'm disembodied, I'm running programs that cause me to label embodied people as dissociated. And I'm completely fine with that feedback. In fact, I'd like to hold space for it because that would probably bring me into contact with people who I might have some energy work to do with. Um, so that's like one of the things I'd like to seed the container with before I speak more on my particular experience with Mariam Hasna. And then the other thing I would like to seed the container with is, yeah, I would say that many of the behaviors that I've observed from Mariam Hasna have also been observed by other people. And if you're one of these people, I'd love to hear from you. Um, as I said, we have a lineage space in the Broom called The Stick, and you can go to thebroom.us/safety, or you can find an article on my website, which is nobuhajimichan.com, relating to safety. Or you can just reply or message me or Intrepid Bodies or any of the tenders of the Broom about anything that you'd like to say about your experiences of Mariam Hasna. And I'd love to hold space for them. And eventually, I would like to be able to um, hold space for, I would say, like a healing discussion amongst people who feel that they have perhaps been, not even like necessarily certainly, but even if people feel like they may have witnessed or experienced psychic abuse um, in the proximity of Mariam Hasna, then I would like to hear from you. Of course, like if anyone feels like they've experienced psychic abuse related to me, I would like to hear from you as well, even if it's not directly. And, in general, I'd like to hear about psychic abuse between any parties because I feel like it would give me the opportunity, first of all, to integrate unconsciousness in my field, which may cause me to be unintentionally abusive to other people. But I also feel like it would allow me and the people that I work in the stick with to gain a better understanding of the metaphysical principles of abuse and safety. And then I also feel like we might do some, I'll say, aligned work towards defining abuse in a way that helps people to understand that it's very normative and it's 99% of the time it's unintentional. And I'd say that in doing this kind of work, we may create safer environments or less abusive environments for all of us. And I would also say that eventually we may be able to treat abusers with grace and also treat ourselves with grace as we come to terms with the abuse that we have both experienced and also reified or reproduced inadvertently or unintentionally. And then we may also become more whole internally as well as externally, which is to say that we'll also become safer internally and externally. And then I guess I'll start by saying that I've talked about my path and aspects of my path in many fora, including in Why Am I Like This, but also on other people's podcasts like Tiger Time, which is a podcast that's hosted by a practitioner named Ta'alumot. And you can find that at ta'alumot.space. And there's a podcast called As Woo As You Want, which I've appeared on, which is probably easier to search for, but you can find that on YouTube and Spotify. And I've also appeared on the Broom Radio podcast in the Signal and Noise podcast series with Adam Archetype and on Dojo with Anna Falby. And I've talked about my path in those episodes as well as in many places online. But in this context, I'll say that I was very early in my path when I discovered the work of Mariam Hasna. And I would say that it was around 2019, and I was working at a company called primary.com. And there are a lot of people working at primary.com, so I won't necessarily dox myself by saying that. But I feel like maybe people would be able to figure out what my government name is Primary.com is a tech company which makes apparel for children. And I had basically like started working at primary.com because I had started to run out of money, which I had earned by working at companies like Microsoft and Etsy.com. And I had started a clothing company in 2018. And living and running a clothing company in New York is a very expensive enterprise. And I had started this clothing company with my partner and two of my best friends. And I would say that in the running of this clothing company, I'd basically like unconsciously carried over many of the habits which had caused me to be very successful in some ways in my previous life as a software engineer and a manager of software engineers. But I would say that working in this way with people who did not come from that industry, and also in an industry that I think it's fair to say none of us had like professional experience and had been fairly unsuccessful in terms of like becoming a sustainable company. I think it was successful in like giving me opportunities to resolve my karma. And I think it was successful in the sense of like giving all of us opportunities to exercise muscles which had previously been dormant. And of course, that varied from person to person because we had different specialties. But I would say that I came upon the work of Mariam Hasna at a time in my life when the programming, which had helped me to be like normatively successful enough in my life, had begun to appear to be maladaptive or unsuccessful. And that I was beginning to burn out. And I would say that as these programs burned down, space appeared in my field for new programs and new ways of being. And I'd always been like a long-term meditator. And, you know, you could say I'd always had a movement practice because I played a lot of soccer. But yeah, I would say that I had started to do acupuncture, started to do qigong, and these praxis are much more like metaphysically based, and that they opened up space in my field in a way that is very similar to the processes of opening up previously, I would say, like partially healed or scarred ruptures or wounds in my field so that new wisdom codes could come in. And I would say that some of what came in led me to Mariam Hasna, which is to say that the person who helped me get in touch with acupuncture and you know, I would say like acupuncture opened me up to like Bakwachang and Qigong. That person also introduced me to the New Earth Mystery School of Mariam Hasna. And, you know, by the time I discovered Mariam Hasna, I would say that I'd already started to feel like big surges of energy in my body. And this is at least how I remember it. And all of this was like cultivated. I would say like those big surges of energy in my body came through some of these reopened and I would say reorganized portals of space and time in my body so that I'd become able to use these surges of energy in my body as guidance. And I feel like I've talked about how I ask my body yes/no questions, right? So I'll be like, is my name Nobu? And then I'll feel a surge of energy in my body, which causes my head to like nod. and then I'll say, "Is my name Jackie Chan?" And my head will shake because my body is moved to shake my head in order to indicate no. And at the time, I would say my body hadn't yet activated the ability to shake my head because my feeling for no had not quite reorganized itself. But I did back then and continue to get really strong surges of energy in association with the orchestration of, I would say, like affirmation in my body. And it was surges of energy in my body, which not only led me to take on the suggestion of checking out New Earth Mystery School with Mariam Hasna, but also led me to a spiritualist named Kensu Neferhetep and the so-called Born Day tribes and communities relating to the Born Day tribes. And I feel like that's a pretty adequate description of like my way of being when I came upon New Earth Mystery School. And when I got to the New Earth Mystery School, yeah, I would say I found a website which was like adequately designed and had like really beautiful photography of flowers and spiritual devices and spiritual praxis and Mariam Hasna herself, who I would say is like a very charismatic woman. Um, I'd say like back then I probably found her, I don't know if like the term like attractive is quite appropriate, but I'd say she seems strong and confident and like definitely like not unattractive. But I would say that like when I saw pictures of her, I felt like surges of energy, which were not sexual in nature. And then I found that like a lot of the topics that she discussed or that she talked about discussing as previews on her website um, were interesting to me, like things like the Akashic records and manifestation and like soul groups. I don't think she mentioned the term twin flames, but hopefully I'm giving you a sense of the kinds of topics that she trafficked in. And I feel like it's worth noting that these are the kinds of topics that you see a lot of spiritual material about on social media. And, I felt called to sign up for a membership, and she had many different tiers of membership. But I'd say that like the core tier was like $33 a month, and signing up to the core tier gave you access to all the recordings of her, I'd say monthly sessions mostly. Um, and those monthly sessions were also sometimes available on a one-time basis where you could just pay to watch particular sessions. But there are also tiers of the membership which gave you um, the ability to receive tinctures and like incense and like physical objects which were supposed to be aligned with the material that you would receive when you became a member and attended her sessions. And I would say over time or different times, being part of the school also gave you access to like monthly community meetings and or qigong classes um, and or dance classes with various people who contributed to New Earth Mystery School, but I don't think could really be said to be either structurally or you know formally introduced as like co-governors of New Earth Mystery School, which is to say that from my perspective, New Earth Mystery School is very much like a Mariam Hasna production, which is to say that, in my opinion, it was a cult. And I want to also say that, like, yeah, basically it became like a monthly ritual for me to tune into a session that Mariam Hasna hosted, which was usually kind of like usually like an interview with another person, but then also like a download of like her gnosis. And this would take place on Zoom, and the chat rooms would be mostly um, open. And this is where I met people like Intrepid Bodies and also um, other people who I'm not going to name right now. And I would say that the chats in those Zoom meetings was really fun. I would say that, like, yeah, I was exposed to a lot of people who I didn't normally overlap with in my lived experience as like a tech worker in New York. Um, I mean, I'd say like in the tech world, the people I tended to work with were not very emotionally demonstrative and were probably, I would say, still overwhelmingly white. Um, and not at all spiritually inclined, or I would say like not inclined towards spirituality in a way which involved praxis or, explicit discussion of the metaphysical experiences that they were having. I would say that like being a physicalist or a materialist is in itself like a spiritual practice. I just say it's like a very veiled spiritual practice. Um, but yeah, it was refreshing for me to be able to like see people being emotionally demonstrative about their metaphysical experiences, and I would say that I felt pretty uninhibited and pretty loud in this chat as well. Um, and I would also say that like probably like 20 or 30% of what I learned from Mariam Hasna um, in the downloads of her gnosis still feel true to me. And I would say like the other 70%, some of it just feels kind of like flaccidly egregious. And then I would say maybe like 10 or 15% feels like actively, or you could say tumescently egregious, which is to say like throbbingly dangerous to me. But I'm also grateful for some of the practitioners I was introduced to through the work of Mariam Hasna. Um, Not in the sense that it was like overwhelmingly beneficial or like you could say like unblemished, but I also met Kenneth Hovet, who I had a couple of sessions with and who I met in person a couple of times. Um, and I would say like I learned a lot from Ken. I would say that probably like 80% of what I learned from Ken still feels true to me. And I would say of the 20% that doesn't feel true, I would say like maybe like 100% of it is like hazardous. Not necessarily dangerous, but I would say that the people who were in my state of like openness and wounding, that 20% ended up being quite dangerous. And I'd say put me on a path of spiritual and material peril, um, which I've talked about in other venues like at length, but I'll say um, led me into like states of being, I'd say, like psychically dependent upon Ken and also like psychically attacked. And um, I would say is like necessary preconditions for periods of psychosis where I experienced like serious suicidal ideation and, I'd say frankly needed to be like rescued by some of the people I had around me. And I would say that I was very fortunate to have people around me like that, not only physically, but also online. Um, and some of the people I've named are some of those people who I would say like were grounded enough and present enough to like provide bridges to consensus material reality, which helped me weather the psychic storms that I was being pushed around in, not only due to what I learned from Ken, but also due to like my interactions with other people who I would say like mostly inadvertently or unknowingly psychically abusive. Um, but I guess like I'm kind of like pause for a second, and I guess like I'd invite intrepid bodies or anybody else to make offerings in reflection of like what I've said so far. And yeah, um, Hoda, if you would like to talk about like your experiences coming to New Earth Mystery School, I'm curious if that feels aligned for you, if you'd want to unmute, or if you'd prefer to text them. I would say I'd read it out, but it feels like it would be hard for me to like truly capture what you might feel called to share if it was in text.
Hi.
Hi.
Um, yeah, I'd love to reflect. So much of what you said, first of all, I just want to say thank you for because I could feel parts of like my field reorganizing based on like your storytelling capabilities and also like I don't know, I also feel like we've done a lot of co-weaving together based on like the consensus of our shared and like individual experiences from having been in community with Miriam Hasna and within her community. Um, And I'd say for me, like, I kind of stumbled upon Miriam's work through like online mutuals
Mm.
and remember coming across her work in 2017. And can I say why I joined? Like, what tweet it was? No, it's being shielded right now. But there was a particular tweet that she had
Mm.
sent out that I was like, wow, like this woman who I agree is charismatic and definitely magnetic, is tapped into something. And for me, like, especially where I was at the time, I was kind of like an undergrad, living at home, working a part-time job, feeling very like cozy in my like material environment that
Mm.
joining something like that felt like I'd say like a plus in like my spiritual
Mm.
path.
Mm.
Um, I was also like praying 5 times a day, um, and like reading the Emerald tablets and like
Mm.
Sufi texts like on my own. And so I feel like also the representation of like Miriam being openly Sufi and like
Mm.
openly reverent was a very big draw for me. I would say like in the game of life, I was like, oh yeah, she's pulling in like the big chips. So I was like, I'm definitely signing up. I was like, oh yeah, this is where the
Big
big leagues
chips.
are. Let's go.
This is so good. Thank you so much. Keep going, please.
And so yeah, like joining and also for me the chat and also the community meetings was just for me an expose of like a type of an archetype of a particular like flame that was like budding in the collective consciousness. And I was like, I don't see this at my
Mm.
teaching gig. I don't see this, in the suburbia of New Orleans, which is where I'm from. And so I was like, this is so dope. And, met people like you and I met people like, I feel like I can talk about like Siobhan and like Kenise.
Mm.
Um, and these are people who I'm still friends with, like to this day and in collaboration to this day. And yeah, I would say that my experience there and the gnosis that was being shared was probably like 15% actually like making a change in my life. And
Mm.
I was like able to like digest the wisdom from other teachers and just the perspective that was being shared that I think I could apply. Like I remember I just started teaching my own workshops. I started like roller skating. I just felt like more like, oh, like I have this like space I can like have these spiritual conversations. And so it felt
Mm.
easier to like um take like leaps of faith in life. So yeah, that 15% was really, really generative. And then I will also say what you reflected about it being a cult is also something that I've reflected on like very deeply and like also came to terms with like while I was enjoying the space, which feels important, I think, for me
Mm.
to like name because it also brought up these like complex feelings that I had to sort of realized that there was also a lot of wounding for me around like cults and also around the
Mm,
community in and of itself, and how it became, or how it kind of, I guess I won't say became because I guess it was always that way, but I kind of like realized that it was, yeah, a Miriam Hasna production. And so from that, I think I realized that also the community was only gonna like quote unquote get me to a certain point in my own like path,
mm,
in my own journey. And so
mm.
it's so funny because I didn't leave all at once. I actually applied for a job first because I was like, this feels like a fair exchange. Like in my mind, I was like, if I get a job with her, then I won't feel like just an audience member, and
Mm,
like somebody
mm,
who's just witness to her growth, Like I was
mm,
growing also in a
mm.
particular direction, and I was like, I want some witnessing or some money, either one works.
Right, and I think it's
Um,
worth saying that, like, probably both of us spent, like, thousands of dollars, right, with her.
right. Yeah, yeah. And also like dollar amount offered, and I
Mhm,
was just like, oh, a job would be sweet. Also because there's a part of me that also felt like I'm a super shield this, but I was like, I feel like I can do what she does. And so for
mhm,
me, I have like a collaborative mindset. I'm like, maybe we could work together. And
mhm,
when that didn't happen, I think for me, I was just kind of like, it was really difficult for me, but I will say it was like something I had to like kind of cut ties with. It's similar with like the work of
mhm,
Kenneth Hover. Like I remember I attended his classes for like a couple months even after I left
mm,
Miriam's like community.
mm,
Um, and I think that I just kind of also realized that I wanted to like mature in a particular way that
mm,
I don't think I could have done while kind of like being under their tutelage, which was like incredibly rich for what it was.
mm,
Um, but I'm also like kind of like glad that I learned from them as well, like what I did.
mhm,
Um,
mm,
and it also helped my discernment a lot, a lot, a lot. So
mhm.
yeah, but it's also
Mhm.
abusive too.
Yeah, I think, like, I feel like what we're trying to say is, like, so subtle, and,
Yeah.
like, I don't mean that just in a way where it's like, oh, like, like, subtlety, I'd say, is normatively associated with, like, refinement. It's like, yeah, I do feel like I'm a fairly refined practitioner spiritually. There's definitely, like, areas of my life where I think, like, refinement continues, and, most people would probably say, I'm not all that refined, right? But, like, um,
Mhm.
yeah, I also feel like we're doing a lot of work to sort of, like, present the context, and, like, one of the things that was coming up for me when you were talking about your experiences before and leading into and kind of like leading out of, I'll say, like, the entourage of New Earth Mystery School is, yeah, like, I think that, like, for me it feels safe to call New Earth Mystery School a cult, and I feel like we're going to get into the dynamics of what makes it a cult, but I feel like it's also worth pointing out that, like, it exists within a social context, or I would call it like a quote overculture unquote, which has cult-like dynamics. Um, and, like, I would say, like, some of like the receptivity of some of us, um, that found ourselves within New Earth Mystery School is, I'll say, quote cultivated unquote by, like, the abusiveness of the overculture, right? So,
Mhm.
like I mentioned, Um, just like some of the things I mentioned were, like, working in a tech environment mostly, being friends with mostly tech people who were, like, mostly white. I'd say, like, the people I was closest to were, like, people of color. And I would say that, like, we were probably close to each other, not just because of, like, similarities between our experiences, but also, like, the wounding that occurred in those experiences. And they were
Mhm.
not identical, right? Like, it's not like I was only friends with, like, Asian males who worked in tech companies. I'd say the closest people that I met, who I'm still really good friends with today from that part of my life, were, like, there's, like, an Asian woman and, like, a Central American man. Um, and there are some white people I'm still like fairly close to, but I would not say that they're like American white. Like they're more like European indigenous people who have light colored skin. um, or like they're not people like one of my friends is from that part of my life is from the south and has light colored skin. But I'd say that for me, whiteness is like more of a socioeconomic thing. So
Mhm.
there are people who are light colored in skin who are, I would say socioeconomically very privileged. And then I would also say that there are people of color who are socioeconomically privileged who I'm not friends with because, there are certain like experiential gaps which are difficult to bridge in current time within the overculture, right? So I'd say that like our shared experiences of being alienated by, I'll call it socioeconomic elitism or whiteness within the overculture created some of the wounds, which created my receptivity to what was being offered in New Earth Mystery School.
Mhm.
And I guess I'll say that like from what you were reflecting upon and sharing, um, like when you mentioned like not having like links to these kinds of people like around where you lived, I feel like it kind of gets to like sort of the same kind of thing.
Mhm.
And maybe like the commonality is like a sense of isolation. And when
Absolutely.
I say isolation, it's like, yeah, well, like isolation exists. Like I wouldn't necessarily say that the overculture is like abusive because of the presence of isolation. Like I think a lot of people might say that like isolation is inherent and then um like the overculture is helping us build links so that we're less isolated through like the creation of the internet, social media, the creation of platforms that allow people to create things like New Earth Mystery School.
Mhm.
And I would say like that's a fair interpretation, but I would say it's wrong because I would say that before we were isolated within, I would say, yeah, like post-industrial capitalist societies, we mostly lived in industrial capitalist societies, which are much less isolated, right? Like
Mhm.
people worked on the factory floor together, and those kinds of environments. I
Right.
think the nuclear family was much more part of like a conjoined social fabric, and in some cases, much less nuclear. And then I would say before industrialism, we had more like communalism based around like agricultural production and agricultural, sort of like, semi-urban, rural, like villages, towns, right?
Mhm.
People were not so, it was pretty uncommon for people to have to travel so that they could find work, so that they could pay for food and shelter. Um, and I'm not saying that like the move towards industrialism or post-industrial capitalism is necessarily bad, but I'm just saying I'm making a case for isolation not necessarily being inherent.
Mhm.
Um, and I would say that like there are many benefits of industrialization and capitalism and post-industrial capitalism, but I would also say that isolation is a wound that was created in achieving some of the goals of industrialized and post-industrial capitalism, um, for example, which is to, I'd say like plant the seeds of like some of what I'm trying to say about like normative culture being a cult. But before I go on, I guess, yeah, I'm curious to hear from you on like what I just said,
Mhm.
if anything's coming up to share.
Yeah, there's well, I definitely agree. I feel like the different modes of like how people gathered and like related to one another is like really important. Like the historical context of that feels really important to name. And I think what you're saying about like making case for isolation, shielding maybe being like contrived and creating like also like a ripe circumstance where maybe like the overculture functions as a cult because people are kind of, I guess from my perspective, I'm wondering if people feel so um like it's an extreme, like either you're isolated or like part of the overculture. And that in and of itself, that polarized dynamic creates like a right, like sort of petri dish for sort of
Mm,
cults to like format, and then also like extreme
well said,
isolation
bro.
to like also like bubble forth. And then also for like
100.
smaller like branches of cults to like form underneath, like like the environment
Mhm.
that caused me to like go online to like seek communities, like neither good nor bad, but it is worth mentioning because it's like,
Mm,
what if the circumstance was different? um
mhm.
so yeah, I'm curious what
Yeah,
comes up for y'all.
100. I mean, like when you say like it's neither good or bad, I would say like for me, the way of saying that would be like there are good parts and bad parts,
Yeah.
right? Like it's not 100% good or 100% bad.
Right. Right.
And I feel like yeah, like this network of like you could sort call it like subcults or subcultures. And I think it's
Mhm.
like maybe we can talk more about what makes a culture different from a cult as part of like, I'd say like weaving the external appearance of this container of psychic abuse. Um, so juicy. I really appreciate y'all being on this journey.
The
But
whole journey.
I'll also say that um yeah, it's like I don't think it's like inherently hypocritical or like invalid to say that like this splintering of the overculture into subcultures and the formation of cults within these subcultures is part of what feels like a bridging process towards a more pluralistic and rich and less isolated, and I'll even say like more spiritually aligned but also spiritually explicit culture, which is also more inclusive. But it but also say that like these are cults and that the dynamics within these cults, within these subcultures, are harmful, right? And like before we started recording, I think I mentioned that the container felt like it was going to be about like taking lumps, quote unquote, um, as part of this process as individuals, right? Because I don't think it would be fair to only talk about how like these are necessary steps towards a more inclusive and spiritually enriched culture and ignore experiences of harm. And like I'm someone I would say who like quote survived unquote those experiences. But I think like you only have to look at like psych wards across the country um to see people who maybe are like not yet like heads above water when it comes to these kinds of experiences. And of course, there are like cult documentaries. And I would say like many of those cults are much more egregious, right? Like in many of the cult documentaries that I've heard of or seen, people actually like met up in person and like lived with the people who were the leaders of those cults. And yeah, I wouldn't say that they experienced more material loss or disparity or perilousness than I did. But many of them were like physically sexually abused. And I can't say that that happened to me in New Earth Mystery School. However, I feel like talking about the dynamics of New Earth Mystery School can elucidate dynamics of psychic abuse, which also occur in those more like physically explicit cults, let's call it those more famous cults. And then I would say also occur in workplaces all around the world, like whether like in industrialized countries or post-industrialized countries. And then I would also say like elucidate dynamics which appear in families or even just like loose social structures like soccer clubs or knitting circles or regular religious institutions which normally don't get called cults, and I'm not exactly sure why. um but I feel like maybe like part of what we're talking about is not necessarily like the answer to the question of why people don't regard those types of organizations as cults or don't regard the dynamics within those organizations as culty. But I feel like maybe we're talking about some of these dynamics and talking about how they lead to harm. And also, like, I think we're talking about like the preconditions and the wounding which allows for harm to happen in like what I dare say is a holistic or a holonic way. Um, and also like with like large doses of grace, but please disagree. Um, and I guess like there's so many experiences that you and I have talked about, and I'll even say there's experiences which I haven't yet talked about with anybody. But I recorded an episode of Why Am I Like This where I talked about my gnosis about I'd say like at the time I think I just mentioned two spiritual practitioners that I was involved in and my understanding that they had been involved in this, or like you could say like their sky ancestors had been involved in interference with my earth ancestors, and some of my earth ancestors I feel are also sky ancestors. But basically like we'd had like what people in the new age spiritual circles tend to call past life entanglements, which past lives, which I don't consider past lives, but I would say ancestors of mine had been interfered with by people who I feel were sky ancestors of, I'll say now, Mariam Hesna and Ken, Kenneth Hover. And that touching into those experiences was like very painful for me, but also I would say very necessary in order for my vessel to harmonize the trauma that had occurred to my ancestors so they could become part of my, I'll say in this context, quote, army of selfhood, unquote, so that I can do the work that I feel called to do in this vessel. And I guess like to kick things off as far as like talking about experiences like in this container, I'll say that I started to have like dreams where like Mariam appeared in my dreams. And I also started to have dreams where both Mariam and Ken appeared in my dreams. And I'll say that uh, those dreams weren't unpleasant at first. Like, I felt like like nothing like super explicit was happening, but I'd say like many of the times I have dreams about this kind of stuff, like I'm just like in a kind of container, and often I'll be contained and the other person will be contained in their own container, and I'm just like watching them do something, and maybe we're just like making eye contact, or there's this sense of transmission. And I had several of these dreams with like Mariam, and then some of them where Ken was also there. And my sense at the time was that we were attending like night school together, and that was like a concept that I had learned from Mariam Hesna, this idea that there are like night schools that you go to. I don't think it's original to Mariam, but like you go into a school when you're dreaming and you learn things which then apply to your waking dream or like quote real life unquote. And then at a certain point, I started to see that Mariam was teaching things which felt like they came from my ancestry. So um, there was a course that she released relating to like working with Davis, and I remember like my partner at the time bought that course, the membership, and it was like $1,111, and which is typical of Mariam Hassan's offerings, right? It was like all angel numbers, which I feel like like at the time I thought was cute, but like since then I've come to sort of like see as being pretty cordy, right? Because like you have this population which is like starting to see repeating numbers and like I think like there are many things we can go into there about like why people start to become aware of them about them, and but I would say like it's fair to say in this context, in brief, that they kind of function as like calling cards or like emotionally charged affirmations for people, and that pricing your offerings using an angel number scale is likely to affect people in, I would say, like non-rational ways, which lead them to feel more emotionally attached to what you're offering and perhaps you as a person. Just as like an example of something which is like, fairly innocuous, but I would say has like a psychic influence and can maybe lead to situations of psychic harm. Um, but yeah, like my partner at the time had bought this course and I attended like one class and I was like, yeah, I don't feel like I need to attend any of these classes because I feel like all of this comes from my ancestry. And I felt like not all of what she was teaching came from my ancestry personally, but I would say that like I had access to all of it through my ancestry. And my sense was that she had gained access to it from me through these dreams, which I had thought were like night school. Um, and I would say that like I had dreams where Mariam and Ken appeared, and this was like during the period where I had started to feel like there were things that Ken had placed in my field which led me to be dependent upon him, and had also yeah, I'd say like created like little wounds around which like ruptures which led to psychosis had kind of like been fostered. And again, like I don't feel like any of this was like intentional. I feel like, to be honest, it comes from like Ken's own unhealed wounds. And I'm trying to say this with like the utmost grace. Um, but like my sense that already at that point had been sort of like, okay, I don't really feel like I can work with Ken as a mentor, certainly. And I feel like maybe I'd started to feel like I was working with him as a peer. Um, and then my sense had been that like Mariam was watching that happen, and like there was some kind of collaboration between my vaster self and Mariam's vaster self on a level which is like much vaster than like our personal vessels, which is to say that I don't think Mariam would have like said, "Oh, I'm working with Nobu." However, I do feel called to say that, like at this time, like I was like a fairly small account on Twitter. Like maybe I had around the same number of followers I have today, like maybe 3,500 followers. And Mariam probably had like more or less the same number of followers that she has today, which is around 250,000 followers. And she followed about 77 or 88 people. This is the angel numbers again at that time. And I was one of them. She's now following 16 people. But like, it was weird for me because like we were not interacting. I'd not done private sessions with her. Um, I'd appeared on camera in some of her courses because, like I said, I don't really have many inhibitions around talking, which you've probably noticed if you've been following me. I've been talking for a while right now, for instance. And I would say that my interactions with her then and on Twitter kind of illustrate to me that like my presence did something different to her field. Like I noticed her becoming uncertain when I was on camera, or kind of being a little flustered. And I would also say there were a couple of interactions on Twitter where I got the same sense of that. And I'd say that all of these experiences sort of like felt kind of affirming. Like I felt like there was something happening in my dreams. Like they weren't just like dreams where I was imagining a projection of this person, but they actually felt like dreams where we were interacting in realms vaster than the material realm. Um, and it also validated my sense that like there was something not quite right about what was going on in New Earth Mystery School and in like the energy exchange between Mariam Hasna and I. Um, and the energy exchange between me and Ken. But it validated the sense that like this was all playing out in a larger way as part of like what I came to this incarnation to do, which I think is still playing out, and also I think like lends itself to this description of like taking lumps on the spiritual path, in the sense that I feel like I had to have these experiences in order to do it. Yeah, I'm still doing. But I guess I'm curious, Intrepid Bodies. Oh yeah, Intrepid Bodies says, quote, I didn't mean to be born on an angel number day, guys, I promise. So I was born on the 9th of September, so it's 9/9. And Hoda was also born on the angel number day. I'm not going to volunteer what numbers they were. Um, Hoda also says implants were something I discovered in my field as well, especially in the quote aftermath. So yeah, I'd love to hold space if you want to talk more about like, yeah, like what kinds of experiences come up to discuss for you in reflection of like what I shared.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing what you shared. And I feel like it's honestly created a lot of space in my field to kind of also, place and like reflect on my astral and also like non-physical experiences with both of them during like, yeah, I would say like my mentorship with them. Um and I had first had also a lot of dreams with just Miriam in them. Um I got a chance to tell her about one of them in a class where she was talking about dream work in particular.
Mm,
Um, and the dream at first like felt very safe. But I also I like just kind of again in the spirit of grace have to name that um during the time that I had had those dreams, I was also feeling very like fragile because my grandmother had passed, and so
mm,
there were there was just a lot surfacing for me. I would say ancestrally, um, and so a lot of the times in my dreams, things would get really interesting. Like for example, I do remember one dream where I had a vision of my grandmother in the dream, and then the context changed, and I suddenly saw Miriam. And so
wow.
for me, like some of my psychic, like I would say, like blinders started to come up. Um,
Mm,
the way that I started attending classes, even after that, was very like we say in New Orleans, like when you do something with not a lot of attention, like you do it passe.
mm,
And I would do a
mm,
lot of the work passe. Like I would just be driving or hanging out with a friend and being like, "Oh, I'm going to tune into this class." I would
mhm,
tell myself that I would like check out the recordings, and I stopped checking out the recordings. Um, then I started to heavily get into Ken's work,
mm,
and was kind of juggling both at the same time. But there was also another experience where my partner at the time, who I was living with, had a dream with Ken and
mm,
Miriam. And he was sharing and reflecting that he felt like he had something to channel from them to me. And
mm,
I remember just kind of feeling like a sense of safety, I would say, that I felt early on, and like dreaming of both of them kind of dissipated at that moment. And
mm,
um it was also ironically at the tail end of one of Ken's ancestral courses. And at the end of the course, he had sort of spoke to each person who attended being initiated in a particular way. Um,
mm,
and in that meditation, I just remember crying a lot in a way where I just felt ripples in my field that were unwelcoming. And I think we're just kind of getting attached to some of my wounding, but I could also
mm,
tell was like being projected onto me from a wounded place.
mm,
And that was also something really common in Ken and I's even one-on-ones where I would cry to the point where I was like illegible. and he would
Mm,
reflect things back to me, and I would either say yes or no. And and that I think the thing that also the final class that I had even attended, or community meeting, I should say, that I had attended in New Earth Mystery School was a very similar experience where Miriam was sort of initiating people into something. And I
mm,
ended up kind of crying and feeling like just this, what I now can see was this like a reverberation of like wounds
mm,
that I think was being perceived as either like clearing or exorcism. But
mm,
that I can now see, especially that I've like kind of continued the work, was again sort of just pinging wounds in a very particular way that sort of created attachment, that created
mm,
codependency, and sort of vilified the yeah, like the astral cult. And so when
mm,
I finally left, I told one of my friends, Kenise, who, as soon as I kind of divulged how I felt about these circumstances, started having dreams of her own and
mm,
started reflecting back that she sort of felt like not necessarily unsafe, but she could definitely verify that we both felt like each time we stepped into these courses, each time we stepped into these containers, particular wounds were being sort of like reified. And that like
mm,
timeline loop we both agreed was like something that didn't feel generative, healthy, and like safe any longer. So
mm,
yeah, it was a super interesting dynamic, and I think for me that is where the clear delineation between like um psychic like cultivation and collaboration, and then like what we're talking about in this container, which is like psychic abuse, essentially.
mm. It's so subtle. Um, so many things are coming up to me because, like, I don't want anyone to hear about this stuff and then feel like necessarily dreaming of other people is like
Absolutely.
a collaboration or even like an interaction between like things which are connected to those actual people and things
Mhm.
which are connected to you. Like I think there's absolutely dreams we have where it's just like our projection of another person appears and there's some
Totally.
work to do. Um, yeah, I feel like the only way that one can know is like through the inner knowing, which I'd say like comes from like cultivation of one's like integrity. Um, but I feel like this is why so many of my lineages are like, quote nameless unquote, or Taoishness is probably like the closest thing to a named proxy for my lineages. And they say that the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. Because like, just because something happens where someone appears in a dream and it even appears safe and then like you find out that it maybe wasn't exactly safe does not mean that every time someone appears in a dream that feels safe that something unsafe is happening. And this is
Right.
not only defensive because I know that I've appeared in lots of people's dreams, even people who I've never interacted with in
Mhm.
person. um you know People like, I wouldn't call it interaction when people see my content on social media, for instance. um but of course there is interaction between like something I've said and somebody else, and like, yeah, I appear in people's dreams, and like my sense is that like there's no abuse happening in those dreams.
Mhm.
And I'd say that like I do my very best to make sure that like I'm integrated enough so that like when I'm dream walking, I'm not doing things which are damaging to other people. And I'd even say it's possible that this happens even when people are doing their very best.
Mhm.
But I think this is part of what I mean when I say it's just like so subtle. And I think if nothing else, I feel like if there's one thing that people are taking away from this, then um, I feel like the importance of integrity and having earnest application when it comes to one's own healing and trauma integration is super important, no matter what form it comes in. And also like may not be complete, but at least for me in current time it feels important to like care and be aware of what can happen due to unintegrated trauma. And I think
Mm,
we've both done a pretty solid job of talking about how some of the mostly unconscious things that, say Ken and Mariam did or didn't do with us came from unresolved trauma and
mhm.
also caused harm because of like our own unresolved trauma, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Like I think it's fair for me to say that, like, yeah, if I was completely healed, which I think nobody is, then I wouldn't have been vulnerable to these things. If
Right.
I had like a community which spoke about spiritual experiences as if they were normal, and not only normal but also possibly generative, and like I would say like a well-woven community fabric or social body or communal body, then I don't feel like I would have been so receptive. Couple of birds just landed on my balcony. That I don't think I would have been so receptive to these kinds of abuse. Um, but that's not the situation that most of us live in, and I feel
Mhm,
like that is a situation that more of us are, you know, moving towards upon like winding ways and like, some people call them like pathless paths, but like I would call them like
mhm,
meandering journeys. Towards like living in like communities which are more richly interwoven and also like more explicit and safe and joyful in their discussions of metaphysical experiences. Um, but I don't want people to leave this container with just one takeaway. And so I guess I feel called to, I mean, there's so many things that we've discussed between us in private and also in public containers, regarding like the subtle body dynamics of like what we felt
mhm.
in relation to Mariam and Ken. And I don't think I feel called necessarily to like rehash all of those, but um, I do feel called to like hold space for a discussion of like some of like what we've learned in the public sphere about how other people were affected by contact with Mariam. Um, Does that feel aligned to you? Or, I mean, if you want to talk about some of the other stuff I mentioned, I'd also hold space for that.
Yeah, no, that definitely feels aligned.
Okay. I mean, I'll say that, like, maybe, like, the most visible cresting wave of this, like, I would say, cosmic journey,
Mhm,
um, is probably for me, like, what came up around, Saki.
mm,
um, on social media, I think as like a relatively like prominent voice.
mhm.
Um, and I guess like, there's so many things we could talk about. And again, like I want to hold space for more discussion about this offline, but well, sorry, outside of this container, online probably at first at least. But yeah, do you want to start? Like, I don't know. I'm not trying to pass the buck, but I just feel called to like
Yeah.
hand the mic over.
No, it's super interesting because I that was the first thing that came to mind because I'm like it was the I guess departure of Saki from the team of like being
Mm,
part of the co-cultivation of New York Mystery School kind of feels like the most richest like example of how other people have experienced like what we're talking about. And I also feel like it's important because it also reflects some of the subtleties. Like what comes to mind is like the fact that um, the popular like I guess reflection or like the populace reflects that basically angels told Miriam to let Saki go as like a collaborator on her
mm,
team.
mhm,
Um, I think also the oh my god, there's so many different dynamics that I kind of
mm,
scried that were like at play when I first kind of saw it happen. And as I scry that timeline, um, I also see like the individual wounds, but also like the collective wounds that brought to the surface because there were also a couple of other people who were close to Saki that were speaking out on Saki's behalf as
mm,
members of New Earth Mystery School and also part of like an inner cohort that
Mm.
ended up sort of quote unquote seeing, I guess, Miriam's true colors, um, and like departed shortly after Saki was let go as well. And so like that's like the material sort of reflection of I think what happened. And I think there was also some really dank, and I can say dank now because I feel like grounded. And like
Right. I think
I
I think it's
yeah,
worth acknowledging that all of this stuff happened like more than 2 years ago, and I feel like both of
yeah,
us have sort of like been checking in on like yeah, like the process of healing from it, so that we can talk about it in what I feel is a pretty uncharged way and like a
yeah,
gracious way. Because I would say that yeah, like it hasn't always felt possible to talk about this in a gracious way based on the psychic, I'll say, harm that occurred. But please go on.
yeah. No, and I guess I was gonna pose a question is kind of like how did you scry or like what did you sort of see, from a metaphysical perspective from that moment in time?
Oh, metaphysically. I mean, I'll say like physically. I love that you said letting things go because it gives me an opportunity to talk about something which is like a bridge to normativity, right?
Yeah.
Like my experience of like being in corporate workplaces in America is that there's like a lot of blurring of the lines between like being let go and being fired and quitting, right? Like
Mm.
for me, I'm going to talk about three exit dynamics. Like one is somebody quits. And my understanding, like usually when someone quits is like depending on the state that you work in, you have to give notice or you don't. Like in New York State is like a so-called at-will state, so you can be fired or you can quit without notice. But you know, quitting is when somebody leaves of their own accord, will. Um, and then usually, like I would say, like the technical term is like um, being made redundant, right? So like what this means, like from like a compliance or legalistic perspective, is that the company has decided that they can no longer support your position. So in closing the position, you're being made redundant, right? And usually, depending on like the place, like it's either like like you have to be legally compliant by offering what's often called severance, which is basically like you give the person enough money so that they can like survive while they're looking for a new job. Um, and it's sort of like, like I'll call it like a mea culpa, like a my bad on the form of the company. It's like we thought that we could support this position with our commercial activities and we can't. Therefore, it's not your fault because we told you that we could support you and we understand that you're dependent upon our pay for you to survive. And it's not easy to find a new job. So we're going to pay for you to find a new job. And I would say that this is more of a feature in countries which don't have a strong a social safety net or social security net. Because, like in some countries, like the government will step in and pay for like your livelihood while you're looking for a new job, and sometimes they'll even help you look for a new job. And sometimes there's a bit of both. And I would say often the government capacity to be able to do that is funded by corporate taxes and also personal income taxes, right? Um, but that's like the second category is like first is quitting, then secondly there's being made redundant and severance. And then thirdly, there's like I don't think there's a technical term for this, but I'll just say it's called getting fired, which is like you were not doing your job as described, and you are, maybe you get some notice, but often maybe like in nice workplaces, they'll like let you know and then they'll give you feedback and they'll try and give you opportunities to improve. And then if you don't take those opportunities, then you get fired, right? Like you stop receiving money, you're no longer allowed into the workplace. And good luck, but maybe often sometimes not even good luck, right? Like, but you're gonna have to survive without this income. Um, and maybe you'll get support from the government. I think it's also worth saying that like when you quit, you don't get severance and you don't get support from the government in many countries because you've decided to relinquish income because you no longer want to do the work for which you were receiving this income. Um, and I think like yeah, like in my experience in America, there's a lot of blurring of the lines between these categories. Like sometimes you get fired, but people call it being let go, and you don't get severance. And sometimes you get made redundant and you do get severance, and people will call it being fired, and they'll sometimes call it being let go. Um, so why am I saying this? I'm not exactly sure, but I feel like I'll bridge it and say that like my understanding of the situation is that um, I would say that like Saki was being fired, but she was being told that she was being made redundant, or there was like a lot of ambiguity about like I think like in my opinion, if someone's not doing what you want them to do, there are like many ways to like make that known and give them opportunities to I could say like give both parties or all parties opportunities to reconcile expectations and reset expectations so expectations can be met. And in the article that I wrote about safety, I feel like it's a long article, but I would say that it's basically about like understanding what causes us to make and break expectations so that we can make expectations better and therefore fulfill expectations more consistently and then build trust between people, um, in addition to or in the absence of faith, right? But my understanding is that like that didn't happen in Saki's case with Mariam. I feel like there was a lot of ambiguity. My sense from reading the post at the time is that Saki had asked for severance and I believe not received it. And yeah, I would say like this is like where it gets metaphysical because I can't say I know from my experiences in the physical realm more about anything that feels pertinent to mention. But um I would say like metaphysically my sense is that like Saki was a threat to Mariam. And I feel like this will allow me to talk a little bit more about like what I believe are like cult dynamics and maybe talk about them in ways which are similarly connectable to people's regular, degular, normative matrix experience in the way that I talked about the difference between quitting, being made redundant, and being fired, right? But I'll say that like again, like I had started to like make distance between myself and New Earth Mystery School, but what I remember is that Saki was like basically like I'd say like the official title was community manager, but she was also responsible for like doing energy work and like setting the containers in the community meetings, along with probably a lot of other things, physical and metaphysical, which helped, I'll say, the cult of New Earth Mystery School. And it sounds like she was getting paid for it for a while. But I feel like metaphysically, my understanding is that the work she was doing was super powerful and like really responsible for keeping the crew together, um, and also providing cohesion to the community of New Earth Mystery School. And my sense is that like Mariam started to feel threatened in some ways or like triggered in some ways by Saki. Maybe not just like how she showed up in public, but also like how she showed up in private in some ways, perhaps. Um, I'm actually really interested to understand what Saki's relationship is like with Ken nowadays, because I know that Saki is like one of the practitioners that Ken would recommend to people when he had so much business that he couldn't book enough sessions, which is wild to me because, as like a mystic who gives private work, I've never really been in a situation where I'm so booked that I need to like pass on business to other people. But I'll say that I have passed on business to other people because it feels aligned for them to work with those people and not me, which I don't think is necessarily true of many spiritual practitioners. Not to like toot my own horn, but I'm just talking about dynamics, right? Which I think people can think about, or like be served by in some ways. But yeah, my sense is that on vaster levels and on spiritual levels, which is to say on like etheric soul levels or like vaster beingness levels, and on the level of like Mariam's personality, there was this like a hostility that brewed between their personalities. And this is all just my projection, right? Like, I haven't talked to Saki about this, definitely haven't talked to Mariam about it. I have talked to other people who are on the inside of Mariam's organization who I don't feel called to name right now. But, I think that this hostility arose because I feel like in Mariam's mind, and probably in the minds of many people, this was a one person show, right? Like, which other people worked in. Sometimes they were compensated, sometimes not. I'd say, like in the case of me and other people who had dreams where it felt like there was like metaphysical astral robbery, it was not compensated. I would say that even when there were people working explicitly for Mariam, like in her organizational structure or collaborating with her in ways which were compensated, my sense is that there was metaphysical robbery, which was not, yeah, I mean, it's metaphysical robbery because it wasn't compensated, which is to say that Mariam was compensating them, let's say, for like their time and their material work, but that there was immaterial theft, which was not compensated for, which I would say is being compensated for as time goes on, somewhat through like the unfolding of this container. Um, but yeah, like I think to make it like a bit more explicit, like I feel like Mariam's vessel stole wisdom codes from other people's lineages based on either their presence in New Earth Mystery School or their presence in like, work that she's done outside of New Earth Mystery School and privately, or by being in her organization, or by collaborating with her. And those people might not feel that way, and I'm super open to being told that I'm wrong. I feel like that's how I refine. But I also feel like I'm not. And, there are refinement opportunities all around in me saying this and people hearing it and meditating upon it. But I guess like I feel like what connects this to people's like regular consensual reality experience is the material artifacts and the kind of like emotional signaling, like the behavioral signaling of an organization being a one person show, right? So, like, most corporations have a CEO, and that person is like, in like, I'll say, like, the parlance of like hip hop is like the HNIC, right? Like, uh, well, yeah, I won't expand that. If you know, you know. Um, like, and I would say that the material artifacts of that are often like in operating agreements. Um, they're often like in like employment contracts. They're often the way that money flows from outside the organization into the organization and ends up being distributed within the organization, right? So like some people get paid a whole lot. And that's a material artifact of power flowing in mostly one direction, like in an asymmetrical direction towards mostly one person. Um, there are organizational charts which show that people report to people who report to people who often report to one person. I would say like it gets a little bit trickier because I'll like when you think about how money and attention flows into a company and how that goes through the company, the apparatus and the organizational of the chart of the company to individuals that often end with one person. And then often in companies which have external investors who don't work in the company, or they have boards, or like if they're public companies and they have shareholders, then that money and attention flows back out of the companies and then through societies again into smaller and smaller spaces, which is to say that like money and attention get siphoned into and out of companies and then into the bank accounts and then into, I'll call it like the astral bank accounts or the astral projections or selfhoods of fewer and fewer people. And I would say that, yeah, again, to like answer this question about what I ascribe metaphysically, this is a lot. And like, this container is called Why Am I Like This? And I would say like this is only like, 0.86% of what flows into me. So like maybe I'm giving y'all a sense of what it is to be like me. And like y'all probably like some of y'all are just like, bro, shut up. But like this is like a tiny amount of like what it's like to be like me and to like synthesize like the phenomena that I feel. Um, but hopefully it's useful in the sense of like bridging how like what connects the dynamics that Hoda and I have taken the time to, and done the work to heal ourselves so that we can share the dynamics that we've shared. It bridges those to the dynamics that people see in religious institutions and like I'll call them like Netflix cults, right? Like cults which are like egregious enough that people have made documentaries about them. um and then it connects those to the dynamics that people see in their families and their social clubs and their workplaces and in the culture that they receive glimpses of overall. um and to summarize, I would say that cult dynamics are dynamics whereby people give their power away, and yeah, sometimes those people are able to come into a greater sense of their own power, and many times they're not. And sometimes that looks like going off the rails and going through many psychotic breaks and like coming into contact with like death and material scarcity, and I'd say like communal scarcity, like social isolation. And sometimes it just looks like people getting paid a decent amount and living a normative life and then having regrets when they die, and I would say like not ascending. But I would say that these are all ways in which people giving their power away can appear. And I would say that like the latter, where people end up getting paid but then end up living dissatisfying lives, is normative, but also I would say like an obstruction to somebody ascending or leaving this life having healed from the damage that they took in this life. And then I would say like, yeah, when people go through like crazy spiritual journeys and almost end up dying and almost end up alone, that's very much not normative, but often those people end up finding their trauma and healing it and then getting out of this lifetime having healed all the wounds that they took in this lifetime, and also having healed many of the wounds that their ancestors took in their lifetimes. And I feel like there are many like appearances of this kind of arc in scripture. Like I would say like the book of Job in the so-called Old Testament, or what I know as Torah or Tanakh. Um, I believe that's correct. Is an example of that kind of journey, which is not normative, but also leads to like an ascension process. Um, um, but nevertheless, I would say that they are dynamics where power is given away. And I would say that in many of those dynamics, people suffer, even if they're not sure that they're suffering. But I'd say in many of those dynamics, the suffering is more obvious. Like you have Japanese businessmen drinking their lives away and dying of heart attacks when they're 40. You have divorce because people are so busy they can't attend to the continuity and coherence of their family. You have people growing up feeling neglected because their parents are too busy working. You have physical abuse, you have emotional abuse. which is all downstream, I would say, of like many people normatively giving their power away and their awareness away and their attention away to their workplaces in pursuit of like a better life, which I would say, yes, like we have more electronics, we have more TV shows, we have more TVs, we probably have more cars, but in many ways, I'd say we end up being psychically more wounded than um, people who came before us who had like less material comforts. Um, and I guess I'm looking at the container and something's blinking at me and I'm attempting to like shed light on it. But to connect it back to like, yeah, like psychic abuse and like the very particular cases of psychic abuse that I think Hoda and I have been talking about in this container. Um, I feel like I'll just say that like it's not, again, it's not invalid formally or logically from my perspective to say that I was harmed by these experiences and that I extend grace towards all of the beings who are involved in this harming, including myself and my ancestors who I believe knew that this was going to happen. And also to say that we can do better and that, you know, I honor those who are conducting spiritual praxis and offering spiritual services who aim to do better. And I honor those who may hear this and maybe even aim a little bit higher in doing better in the way that they offer their services to other beings. Um, and again, I want to say if you listen to this and you want to talk to me or Hoda or people in the broom about instances of psychic abuse, you can go to thebroom.us/safety and we have a Google form that you can submit um, at any level of detail that you like. Um, and we'll receive that report and then we can, proceed from there. Um, and, like this webpage is going to evolve, but it will be there no matter when you listen to this, is my sense. And I'd just like to hold space to hear if there's anything that Hoda or anybody else in the container would like to say before I formally close this container. Hoda says having intense deja vu right now. um, yeah, and I feel like Hoda probably had to go into an environment where maybe she's not able to unmute. But she says nothing to say at the moment aside from thank you. And there's like the emoji, which I usually bring up by typing relieved. Um, but yeah, I guess I'm going to close the container by saying thank you to everyone who's here live and saying thank you to everybody who's offering their awareness in a delayed way. I'll say, again, if you want to take part in these containers, you can go to thebroom.us and find the link to join our Discord. You can also listen live by going to thebroom.us/radio without having to join the Discord server. You can support the Broom Radio by going to buymeacoffee.com/thebroomradio. You can become a member by going to buymeacoffee.com/thebroomradio/membership. And I would say that you can support me in my offering of this container by either booking work with me at nobuhajimichan.com or by making a donation at buymeacoffee.com/nobuhajimichan. Thank you again, and good day or good night, depending on when you're listening to this. And I hope to hear from you if you feel called to share in the lineage space in the broom that we call the stick. Peace.